Decoding Learning Differences with Kimberly Lavelle, and this episode is Rewire the Brain with Barbara Young. Now, Barbara Arrowsmith-Young is the founder of the Arrowsmith Program, which is an assessment process and a suite of cognitive exercises designed to stimulate and strengthen weak areas of cognitive functioning that underlie a range of learning difficulties, which has been delivered for 40 plus years throughout the world. Her work, begun in 1978, has been recognized as one of the first examples of the practical application of neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change and rewire itself over a lifetime. As the director of Arrowsmith School and Arrowsmith Program, she continues to develop and refine programs for students with learning difficulties. Her vision is that all students struggling with learning will have the opportunity to benefit from cognitive programs utilizing the principles of neuroplasticity, programs that change the brain's capacity to learn and open to these learners a world of possibilities. The genesis of the Arrowsmith Program's cognitive exercises lies in Barbara Arrowsmith-Young's journey of discovery and innovation to overcome her severe learning disabilities. Her inspirational book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain, has become an international bestseller. And while our focus, of course, is on children and students, she has a lot of work with adults as well. So it might be something you are interested in yourself. I definitely took her assessment tool myself because I was curious. And it's a fascinating conversation. So I hope you enjoy. Good morning, Barbara. It's so great to have you on. Your story is so fascinating, so I'm very excited to share that with my audience. Can you very briefly share that story? I mean, I also want to encourage everybody, you have this lovely book that it is an illustrated story, and I think that's a little bit more in depth, but still very accessible for everyone of all ages, it seems. But for the purposes of our discussion, can you give everyone a quick summary of your story?
Absolutely, yes. So my story begins many years ago in the 1950s when I started grade one in Canada. And I was identified in grade one as having a mental block because at that time there wasn't even the concept of a learning disability, right? This predated that concept. So my grade one teacher informed me and my mother that I had a mental block. And being quite literal, I actually thought I had a piece of wood, like a children's cube in my head. And later I learned, no, I didn't have a piece of wood in my head, but I had blockages. I had parts of my brain that weren't working at the level they ideally were designed to work at. But in grade one, I struggled to learn how to read. I struggled to learn how to write. I struggled mathematics. So if somebody gave me 12 and 14 to add, I'd add the 4 and the 1 and then the 1 and then the 2, like just random, like kind of my world was a series of random events. And in grade one, I feel like I was given a life sentence. My teacher told my mother not to have high expectations for me, that all of my learning would be a struggle. So, I certainly spent a significant amount of grade one hiding out in the washroom, which I think, worked for me and it worked for my teacher. I got the strap in those days, because, when I wrote everything backwards, I would make my notebooks really messy because my hand was sweaty and it would, smear the ink. And my teacher thought I was doing this deliberately. Well, it was just the way my brain worked, right? So that was my beginnings. And I would say, I think the teacher was wrong in that I didn't amount to much in my life. I hope I disproved that. And though she was right in that all of my education was a struggle. I can't say, if I think on it, was there a day that I actually enjoyed school? Maybe somewhere in there, but they were few and far between. And my mother was an educator, so she was determined that her daughter was going to learn how to read and write and do basic math. And the school, my elementary school, was right across the street. I could look out of the living room window of my house and there was the school. So I would come home at lunch and I would come home after school and my mother would have flashcards, right? So she would hold up letters and numbers, and eventually I learned how to read, I learned how to write, I learned how to do basic mathematics. And I wasn't grateful at the time, but I'm grateful now to all that effort that my mother put into ensuring that I had those basic rudimentary skills. However, it didn't address the learning difficulty. I mean, I still struggled conceptually understanding, grasping concepts, understanding what things meant. I had a really good visual memory, almost photographic, and a really good auditory memory. So really memory is what got me through most of my schooling. I would memorize all of my notebooks from page 1 to the last page. And then when I wrote an exam, I would flip through my brain to try to find a match to the information that was in my memory to the information that was in the question. And sometimes I did a really good match and got 100%. Sometimes I did a really bad match because I didn't really understand the question, and I might get 10%. And my teachers would conclude that I hadn't worked for that 10%. Well, I worked equally hard to get that 10% as I did the 100%. It was just, again, the way my brain was wired and my understanding. So, that was my schooling. I had later, I learned I had multiple learning difficulties. The part of the brain that attaches meaning, comprehension, wasn't working the way it was designed. I often say it was kind of like my translator was broken. So, if someone spoke to me and, if they asked me, what color is my dress, I could answer that because it's very concrete. But anything abstract, was really, really a challenge. So things like science, like mathematics, even, themes in literature, those were all challenging. So I struggled with social relations because I didn't really understand why people did things. And then I didn't understand if they talked to me really what they meant. So I spent a lot of time smiling and hoping that people would leave me alone. And I had a difficulty with knowing where the left side of my body was in space. So I was very clumsy. I would bump into things, trip over my feet, what I call a kinesthetic difficulty. So sports weren't an outlet for me. So I wasn't really good athletically. I wasn't good in concepts or understanding things, and I struggled socially. So I was quite isolated growing up. I could handle maybe one friend, but anymore that was way too complex for me. So yeah, so that was kind of my story and my schooling. And I also one other. So my mother was really instrumental, and my father was a scientist and an inventor, and he had this belief. He said, if there's a problem in the world and no solution, he said it's your responsibility to go out and find a solution. And then he said something that I've held very dear to me. He said, the rest of the world tells you you can't do it. He said, don't listen. He said, this is how science goes forward. It doesn't listen to conventional wisdom. And so as I started to develop first the program for myself to address my learning difficulties, and heard from my professors at university, all sorts of people, this is not possible. There's no neuroplasticity. Your brain is fixed, at your age. And even at that point, they didn't think learning difficulties had anything to do with the brain, because this was in now the 1970s. I held on to what my father had said and said, I'm going to go out and try, and I'm not going to listen because I need to see if I can find a solution. So that, my parents were critical in helping me on the path to overcome my learning difficulties and then take this work out into the world.
Okay, so really briefly, can you tell everyone what you did to overcome your difficulties?
Yes. So I was reading two lines of research, one coming out of Russia, and this was a brilliant neuropsychologist, Alexander Luria, and he wrote a book called The Man with the Shattered World, which was describing a Russian soldier in World War II that had a very localized brain injury. And as I read this man's journal, I thought, I'm writing the same journal, right? So now I knew it was my brain, because before I knew I had significant problems, but if you're going to solve a problem, you need to know where's the source of the problem. So that was the first clue. Okay, something in my brain. I knew I didn't have a piece of shrapnel in my brain, but for some reason that part wasn't working. And then I was reading Mark Rosenzweig's research coming out of Berkeley, and he was looking at neuroplasticity with rats. And he found that if you put rats in a really stimulating, enriched environment, their brains changed functionally and physiologically. They became better at learning mazes. So I thought, if rats have neuroplasticity, surely humans must. And this was, again, 1977. And I was told, no, that's not the case. But I remembered what my father said, go out and try. And so I created the first exercise. And what Luria had talked about with this part of the brain was you couldn't tell time. I was now 26 years old. I still couldn't tell time. I couldn't read a watch because it's a relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand. And I couldn't connect pieces of information. I couldn't see, how things related. I had no insight. So I created an exercise with clocks, and eventually I learned how to tell time because, I did this for hundreds of hours. But over time, as I added more and more hands, and now we have actually a 10-handed clock, I forced my brain to process multiple relationships very quickly. So it was like a workout for that part of the brain. The goal wasn't to tell time. The goal was force my brain to process relationships. And at a certain point, it was like blinders came off. All of a sudden, I could listen to a conversation and I could understand it in real time. Whereas before, I lived in what I called lag time. I was always behind everybody else, and sometimes I never understood. Now I could listen, I could understand, I could actually make an appropriate comment, I could understand their comment back to me. It was so powerful. For the first time, I was part of human discourse. And then I went back and taught myself all of mathematics because now I could grasp concepts. It was just so powerful. So I knew there must be human neuroplasticity because I worked really, really hard. And with the best will in the world, I couldn't do these things that now I could do after I changed my brain. So then I created 2 more programs. One where I had to do all sorts of drawings with my eyes closed to strengthen that part of my brain that did sensory processing and understood where my body was in space. So now I can play sports. I don't bang into walls. I don't dent my car because I don't know where the car is, on the left side, just like I didn't know my body. And then I created an exercise for spatial reasoning because I couldn't read maps. I couldn't construct IKEA furniture. I couldn't build from a 2-dimensional plan into 3-dimensional representation. And then I thought, wow, like I saw all these things change. And I thought, I need to take this work out into the world and help other people who some had the same problems I had, some different. And that was the beginning of my work, which is now all around the world. We train educators to bring this work into their learning centers, their schools, so children have access.
That is so incredible. Okay, so knowing what you know now, is there anything different that you wish your parents or teachers had done differently to help you when you were a child?
It's a really good question. I wish, maybe my grade 1 teacher had been a little more compassionate, but it was the times, right? She didn't know. She was doing the best practice that she knew. I was an anomaly. She was I think this was her first or second year teaching, and she'd never met anybody whose brain was wired like mine. So it wasn't, she was doing the best that she could, given the challenges that I had and the knowledge that was available at that time. So, and I think my parents, if they hadn't done what they did, I don't want to think about where I might be. Maybe I would wish, that there was more open conversations around learning difficulties. But again, there just wasn't the knowledge. Like, it wasn't until I think the late 60s, early 70s that people started this concept of a learning disability or learning difficulty. So, I just kind of have to accept that was the knowledge and the understanding at the time. And then I think, some people ask, would I have preferred not to have been born with the really significant challenges I had? Like, I've met people who've had strokes, and some of my difficulties were equal, like they were very severe. But I can't say yes, that I wished I had been born without those difficulties, because it led me to where I am now. Like, it really, is that nature nurture. So the nature of my difficulties led me to create this work, and the nurture of my parents and their belief systems supported me in creating this work. So, I think this was my life path, to do this work. And so, um, it was painful at points. And here I am.
How much? So I was, as I was kind of reading your story, listening to your story, I was thinking about the fact that in the moment you decided, like, I can change my brain. So way before Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, you had a growth mindset of my brain can change. I can figure this out. And in Carol Dweck's work, we know that, and others, we know that having that belief is, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like if you have a fixed mindset, oh, I can't change, I can't learn anything, then you're not going to learn anything or not much. And if you have a growth mindset, you have that ability to like really grow and learn. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think that that played an important role, or how important of a role do you think that played?
I think it played a really important role. And again, there I credit my father, because, he would come home with his, like he had patents, like he conditioned electricity. I don't understand really all of what he did, but he would come with these huge blueprints and diagrams and lay them on the living room floor. And I caught his excitement, like his, even though I didn't understand anything, but his excitement in the creative process, which is like that growth mindset, like the excitement of creating something that didn't exist, right? Like, kind of that possibility thinking, growth mindset. I mean, we didn't have a terminology for it at the time, but it was infectious. Like, and so he instilled that in me. And again, that belief system, if there's a problem, go out and create a solution. And it's your responsibility to do that. Like, and this is how, the world progresses and science goes forward. And that absolutely is a growth mindset. So it was part of my family experience. So that was really fundamental, in supporting me in creating this work. And certainly as I was creating it, I had lots and lots and lots of people tell me I was crazy, this is ridiculous, this is not possible. But again, I held on to that, that message that my father had given me. And I didn't know if it was going to be successful. It was like in science, you create a hypothesis, you say, based on this information, it's possible, this might be possible. And but I figured I have to try, because my life was getting more and more constricted. I was now in graduate school. I was sleeping 4 hours a night, working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week. I, would have pneumonia like several times every winter, because driving my body beyond what was humanly possible. I developed an immune system disorder. It was a huge cost. Having this learning difficulty was a huge cost to me, emotionally, physically. And so I thought, I have to try. I may not be successful, because sometimes, you aren't when you set a hypothesis and experiment, but I have to try. And I was successful. And over the history of developing this work, there's sometimes things have ended up in the waste paper basket, and then you go back to the drawing board. I mean, and you refine it, or you try something different, and until you get the outcomes that one expects to change the brain. I mean, to me, our brain filters our perceptions of ourselves, our understanding of other people, our understanding of our world, our relationship to the world. It's, no matter what we're doing, our brain is involved, across our day, and we can't kind of escape it. Like, we carry it everywhere we go. And the power, if we can harness neuroplasticity and change the brain, to me, it's probably one of the most positive and optimistic developments, certainly in my lifetime, and huge applications. I mean, my work is in learning difficulties, but we're also doing research in addiction and seeing the benefit. We're doing research, long haul COVID, that's affected people cognitively, seeing the benefit. Situations where there's been spousal abuse and trauma to the head, we're seeing benefits. car accident, stroke, like a whole range. There's other research, not my research, looking at chronic pain and neuroplasticity. To me, it's just incredibly promising. This organ that when I grew up, I was told was fixed, and basically you got a problem with it, you got to live with it. Well, we know that's not the case. And how hopeful is that?
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I think your story is fascinating, and I agree. It's really important for the world. It's shaped so much of like my work as a special education teacher, now a tutor and consultant, like knowing that we can change the brain does impact things. And I do still see a lot of fixed mindset, that wording and beliefs, even if people will say, oh yeah, there's neuroplasticity, but then the way they talk about a student does sound permanent. Like, well, yeah, this is the part of the IQ that doesn't really change, and things like that, where they've got this fixed mindset. So it's interesting. So I definitely see that we are still in that shift of realizing the true potential of neuroplasticity's ability to change our brain. I think especially when it's partnered with that growth mindset of, I can change my brain, I will change my brain, and all of your work in figuring out those programs. So if a parent is listening right now and they're like, which I'm guessing a lot of them are listening and thinking, my child is struggling, what can I start doing right now to support my child's learning? And what can I do to rewire their brain so that they're not struggling? And what does that look like? What is that path for them?
So I think a number of things. I think one, listen very deeply to your child, right? I mean, parents spend a lot of time with their children, and so listen very deeply. If your child is saying that they're struggling or exhibiting behaviors, right, where the thing is, you see them excelling in certain areas, but other areas they avoid or they're backing away. Well, we all have mastery motivation. So if there's something the child is avoiding or backing away from or not attending to, there's probably a good reason. So it's kind of listening to your child, observing, and going in and having a conversation to try to kind of get to the basis of what is going on in that child's life. Advocating for your child, like how often do I hear, oh, that mother is just overly concerned or overly dramatic? No, like mothers know their children, right? So go in and advocate with your teacher for your child, and help the child or the teacher really understand what your child's experience is like, because I think the first place is really understanding, because often we generalize, like if a child's struggling, we think, well, it's everywhere, but no, it's probably in this particular area because of whatever cognitive function isn't performing on par. So that's the first level. We also have a questionnaire on our website if people are interested. That's free, confidential, that you can fill out for your child, or an adult can fill out for themselves. I've had spouses sometimes fill it out, and it can be a very interesting conversation.
Yeah, I went online and did it. I loved it.
Okay. Yes. So go ahead, like do that and share it with your school. Also, we have people that are happy to have a conversation with you. We're in educational organizations around the world. I think there is one in the San Francisco area. So reach out if you've done the questionnaire and you have questions, to have a conversation, to help understand what that cognitive profile means, because we have multiple different cognitive functions, and some can be working really well, some average, and some are weaker, and they're creating a drag on the system. So I think understanding is the first level, and if that cognitive questionnaire can help, great. And then and so with that information, and if the teacher is provided with that information, they can start maybe modifying how they deliver the curriculum to the child. Now, that's not changing the child's brain, but it's having more insight and understanding as to the best way that child learns, given their current cognitive profile. The next piece is of interest. And we have online programs. I mean, that was one of the things that COVID drove us to, because we were in multiple schools all around the world, and all of a sudden the doors closed. And we had students who we needed to continue to provide the program to. So in 3 weeks in March 2020, we went online all around the world. And then we created a development community with the educators. What would you like to see? How can we improve this? And then I'm a big research geek, so I looked at all of the data over the last 2 to 3 years, and we're getting exactly the same results in the online. So we have a more independent online, we have a virtual classroom where you come into a classroom online with facilitators, and then we have the in-person experience. So it almost doesn't matter where the child is in the world, they can access this work. And we have multiple options, to try to make this work accessible. And then the other thing is, go to your school and advocate. Say, I'd like to see a cognitive program in my school, and parents have been very successful. I mean, a lot of the schools that we're in, it's because, mother went and knocked on that door and said, hey, I want you to look at this. We go to school to learn. We learn with our brain. It's time we put the brain into the education equation, not just as a kind of a passive vehicle, but something, as the child is learning, we can actually change the brain. And we're doing studies in New Zealand, studies in Madrid in Spain, where students in grade 1, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, are doing a developmentally appropriate cognitive exercise, grade 2 a different one, grade 3 a different one. And those students are outperforming students in the same grade not getting the cognitive exercise in really like processing speed, selective attention, working memory, like really critical cognitive abilities, not just for grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, but for the rest of their life. So I think start with listening and advocating and understanding, then, advocating, lobbying the school to say, hey, let's look at cognitive programming as an integral part of education, and look at some of our online or even in-person offerings that might be in a location where the parent is. And if not, then we've got the online options, to access this work.
Yeah. I love that. And I love that idea of putting it into the schools, because I know that's one thing that I've always been fascinated by, the brain. So like when I was in college, I knew I wanted to be a teacher, but I also got a degree in psychology, and I'm always like craving that information. I'm always trying to figure out like what is going on in the brain of my students. How do I really help them? Like, yes, there's, various teaching methods, but is it really helping them long term, and how big, and how do we overcome the underlying problem that's making learning so difficult for them? Mm-hmm. Besides, flashcards to get them to learn something, what else can we do that's deeper and more impactful for long term? So I love that. I'm definitely interested in finding out more about all of this. One thing I think I heard you say was that you're able to improve children's working memory. And previously I had heard that you're only able, that the research, but I also always know research is always changing and growing, and sometimes we just haven't figured it out yet. Previously, my understanding on working memory was they're saying you can improve working memory for a specific task, and the child's ability, their working memory for that task will improve, but it won't generalize to improving working memory overall, which I always found strange, because most things kind of generalize. Do you have any information or research or anything that comes to mind about that?
Yeah, so my view on working memory maybe it's a little different from the field. I believe every higher order cognitive function has an aspect of working memory. So whether and a lot of it is driven by the prefrontal cortex, right? Like, your left and right prefrontal cortex versus the executive functioning of the brain is, that problem solving, strategizing is the part of the brain, you're given a problem to solve. And what part of the brain activates first is the prefrontal cortex. It's kind of setting the stage. Okay, how do I tackle this problem? what resources do I need to bring to bear? What other parts of my brain do I need to bring online? Like if it's a math problem, then I need to bring certain areas online to be able to solve that. If it's a social problem, I've got to bring other areas. So working memory is it's also a combination of the prefrontal cortex, which is that kind of organizer, driver, activator of the brain, and then the other regions of the brain in the neural networks that need to, hold information or operate on information to solve the problem. So there's no one working memory. And that's why I've probably over my career looked at thousands of psychoed reports, like thousands of them. And one says, oh, there's a working memory problem. Well, you look at it, well, actually, it was an auditory version of a working memory, and that person had an auditory memory difficulty. So of course they're going to have a problem there, or some it's numbers, or some it's, letters. So it really depends on the nature of the assessment that's saying whether there's a working memory problem or not. But and it's because it's really a fluid concept. There's a problem to solve. Working memory is you've got to hold elements in your mind's eye or in your mind and operate on them to be able to solve that problem. So it depends on what's the problem to solve and what cognitive functions do I need? Because if it's a social problem, you're probably not going to call on those regions that are related to calculation or computation, right? Or if it's a spatial problem, like you're building a bridge, you're going to call in, a bunch of elements related to the right hemisphere to be able to solve that. So, and what we're seeing in our work is as we change the cognitive function. So our program can work on 19 different cognitive functions. I have different programs for each of those to strengthen them. And as they're strengthened, then they can come into the problem solving process, whatever it is, where they're required. It's kind of like building blocks. Like when we read, there are 9 different cognitive functions that have to all operate to be able to read. So, you can see a child with identified with a reading difficulty, or you can see 3 children identified with reading difficulty, and they can have different profiles because this one may have 3 of those 9 areas underperforming. This other one may have 3 different of those 9 areas underperforming. And that's why I always argue there's no one size fits all, and we have to go under the label. So under the label of dyslexia, under the label of dyscalculia, under the label of dysgraphia, to understand for that individual which specific cognitive functions are underperforming, because that's what we need to strengthen. And then they can read, or they can write, or they can handle numbers. And we've worked with students as young as 5 and into their 90s, right? And to me, it's exciting. Like there's neuroplasticity across our lifespan. So, if there's been something that's niggled at somebody and they're 75, it's never too late to strengthen a part of your brain. I had a professor, she was in the medical department of the University of Toronto in the anatomy, professor of anatomy, and she'd never been able to recognize faces. So at 74, she came in and decided, I want to do this, right? And we have a program for facial recognition for that part of the brain. She worked through it and she made the same progress as a 15-year-old, right? And now she can recognize faces, and she, when she goes to a party, she doesn't feel awkward because she recognizes who those people are. So if we start with understanding what's the job of that cognitive function, we can create an exercise or an activity to stimulate and work it, just like, physiotherapy for a specific muscle group. And then we can strengthen it. And whatever job that function has, it allows the learning to go forward because it's now operating within the neural network effectively. So I don't know if that answered your question on working memory sort of in a roundabout way, but it's complex. But these cognitive functions that we can strengthen are components that are brought into working memory tasks to solve problems.
Yeah, no, I think that did, because I think it makes sense. I think what you're saying still aligns with what the research is saying. And it's something where we don't then have to look at the research and say, well, we just can't really work on it. We can work on it and it is sort of, you're saying it's dependent on what that specific task is. And And I think it definitely is what we're seeing of the kid is really struggling in this specific area, and then yeah, we throw the blanket working memory on it. But I agree that it is multiple parts of the brain that are working together. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I also, no one size no one size fits all. Like I agree with that, because and the labeling, I hear parents talk about like, oh, but my child needs this needs to be identified as dyslexic or the school won't know how to teach them. I was like, but I won't know how to teach them if you tell me they're dyslexic. Like I need more than that. I need more details than that. Because there are, like you're saying, there's different things that are happening in the brain, and there's a majority of kids with dyslexia that are all kind of struggling with this cognitive function, but there's some that it's something completely different, and how it's happening makes such a difference. So I think you're so right, and like you said before, bringing the brain into education and learning is critical, and keeping that in mind, that there is no one size fits all. That's like when I'm tutoring, I don't use any one program because I need to individualize to every single child.
Absolutely. I think that's really, really key. And what I say to parents, if you go to somebody and they say this one program is going to fix everything, I said, walk out the door, because
Right.
it would be lovely if that was the case, but our brain is incredibly complex. Like it just doesn't work that way. So I think you're absolutely right. There is no one size fits all. And one of my staff, my executive directors, just doing a presentation in Medellin, Colombia, not online, right, to a big global education forum. And, it's on equity in education. And I said, what is the great equalizer is our brain. Like every single one of us has a brain. Like we may not have the same economic factors, we may not have, the same access to different resources, but we all have access to a brain. And if we can, again, put the brain in the education equation, we give all of these individuals an equal opportunity to excel and to function. I think, what would my life have been like if in grade 1 there was a cognitive exercise, and in grade 2 another one, in grade 3 I would never have had the social emotional fallout that I had with my learning difficulties. Like I ended up in therapy for a number of years just because of the trauma of my struggles. And it just normalizes. Like we all go to school, to learn, we learn with our brain. So everybody is working their brain. So there's no stigma. Oh, I've got to go to a special place, to get this kind of help, because every child can benefit. So I think, our brain is our great equalizer if we just put it into the education equation. And I think your comment earlier about, paradigm shift. I've been making these arguments for 40 plus years, but in terms of a paradigm shift, that's not a long time. It
Yeah.
feels like a long time, but it's coming. And they've been silos. Like neuroscience is over here in this silo, education is over here, and it's now, I think we're starting to bring the information together. And I find, like, the educators that I get the privilege to meet all around the world who are implementing this work, they got into education because they wanted to make a difference in the lives of their students. And this work really allows them to do that and see those differences. So they're really excited, and they embrace it, but they weren't educated in teachers college on this kind of work. So, my hope is that this becomes a normal part of teachers' education as well.
So while we agree, no one size fits all, what I'm now wondering is, would it benefit all to have, as part of their education, going through the grades, well, right now we're working on reading, right now we're working on math, right now we're doing cognitive exercise A, and working through 19 different cognitive exercises over the years that are working those kinds of, or is that a waste of time for too many kids? Is it You know, what would your vision be? Like, would
Yeah.
you want it to be that generalized, or do we need to stay specific to each kid?
I would start with being generalized because we have hundreds of levels in each of the cognitive exercises. So the individual, if they struggle, they're like, or don't struggle, they're going to hit their level very quickly. That's the right one where their brain's engaged and it's driving neuroplastic change. So whether they have a difficulty, whether they're average or even whether they're gifted, we have levels that they will meet, which then will push their brains, which is the basis for all learning. And we picked exercises. So in grade 1, it's the part of the brain that's involved in motor planning, which is in writing, eye tracking, and reading. In grade 2, we've picked the what I call symbol recognition. It's the part of the brain that holds visual symbol patterns, which is critical for spelling, for reading, even learning math formula, chemical equations, any kind of visual template learning. Grade 3, the part of the brain that's related to quantification and numeracy. So we've picked, cognitive functions that are appropriate for what the demand and education is at that time. And we have so many levels that all children can benefit. And then for those students, who like myself maybe needed a bit of extra work, I would see having a cognitive classroom that's running, that students can come in and out of over the course of the day for maybe 1 or 2 more periods, like because maybe they need a couple of more areas than just the area that's being worked on in that class. So then that would meet those students' needs that have more significant difficulties, and they would also be getting work in the regular classroom, and all the students, even the ones that don't have difficulties, benefit. And that's what we've seen in the research, that all of these students benefit. And then it's just normal, like you go to school to learn and you work your brain at the same time you're learning. So again, we remove the stigma, because there's still a tremendous amount of stigma related. I'm sure you know that in your work. I see it when I go around the world and meet with students. And that kind of breaks my heart. Like I thought, yeah, I understood in the 50s and 60s because we didn't know much, but to actually see it today. And I think this could help address that, because it's just a normal part of education.
Right. So are there schools that you guys have gone into that have done this, where everybody in grade 1 is working on this plus some extra? Are there schools doing that?
Yes, there's a school in Madrid in Spain that's doing it. There's a school in Wellington, New Zealand that's doing it. And then we've done a number of schools where they haven't done like the whole model, but they've maybe picked one grade. So there are multiple schools. There have been schools in Canada, the United States, that maybe have done it in grades 2 or 3. And then there was a school in Washington State, outside of Seattle, that did an elective for students in grades 6 to 11. So they could pick an elective to work on the part of the brain that's related to reasoning, processing speed, cognitive efficiency, insight, and we got great results. So yes. And now I've been talking quite a bit about this. So now there are a number of schools that for this coming school year want to implement this model. So I'm really, really excited. Like it's like my mantra: put the brain in the education equation.
Yes.
As the great equalizer, and starting to see it. And actually in my book, my vision in the first edition of my book, in the last chapter, was exactly that model. But I thought, I'm never going to see this in my lifetime. I thought this is like really bold and out there. And now we have schools doing it. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I think that's very exciting. And I'd love to dig into more of what their results are. That's fascinating. What was the other thing that came to mind that I wanted to ask you about with that, though? Oh, so when it's in the schools, I guess I'm wondering, like, the delivery of the programs. Is it always computer based, that they're doing activities with the computer or on the computer? Is it always an in-person thing? Is there a combination? Is there like physical manipulatives? Like, what does it look like?
What does it look like? So a range. So some are pencil and paper activities. It depends really what cognitive function we're trying to address and what the best delivery method to address that is.
Makes
Some
sense.
are auditory, so it's listening to things and having to go through a whole process. Some are computer based. So what we have currently is the students right in the regular classroom. So they're in their grade 3 classroom, one period a day, 5 days a week. They're either working on a computer exercise, and there's a teacher in the room that's trained to monitor and facilitate and support the students. But it's like exercise, so it's not like a teacher standing at the front of the class teaching a lesson on addition. It's the teacher is really more like a facilitator and a coach for this, ensuring that the student is engaged, moving through the levels, doing the activity and the exercise. And there's a lot of mastery motivation built in, because you have to keep the students engaged. So they master levels and the computer screen bursts into, congratulations. Some students are doing a, pencil and paper activity. Yeah, so they just switch out of doing curricular activities to doing a cognitive activity for 30 minutes each day. And I can send you a link to some of our research showing the results of this model in the classroom. It's very, very powerful. And then it's just a normal part of education. And that we train the teachers. We've got online training, so they know how to deliver it to their students in the classroom, as they do reading, writing, arithmetic, and brain exercise or cognitive exercise. And they get excited, right? Like, wow, like I'm changing my brain. Again, you talk about that growth mindset. Some of the research we did, we used some of Carol Dweck's measures and found these students develop a growth mindset, because you can't be in a program where you're changing your brain and think your mind is fixed, right?
Right.
It's kind of counterintuitive. And they developed locus of control, like where they saw themselves as agents of change in their lives, more happiness, even reduction in cortisol. We measured cortisol because they were less stressed. These were students with learning difficulties, right? And having a learning difficulty is a stressor that you can't really escape very effectively. And so the fact that the students were reporting all these changes, parents were observing changes, and physiologically their body was registering that change with reduction in cortisol. So yeah, it has really big implications.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing, because that's always one of the difficulties, is those kids already have a learning disability, so then they start feeling badly about themselves and having stress, which then is shutting down more of their ability to learn and just puts them further behind and makes them feel worse. And it's like this horrible snowball effect that, and I've seen that, when we are able to get kids starting to make progress, they can suddenly make a lot of progress because they can suddenly believe that they can make progress. So I think that's so exciting, that pairing that all with these cognitive programs, cognitive functions. So how long have those programs been in place in the schools? I know you've been doing it for a very long time with individuals. I'm just wondering about how long the schools have been working on it.
Yeah, so I started many, many years ago, and I think it was about 1995 that I thought I have to, like, I had my school in Toronto, but I thought I have to take this out into the world, right? Just to make it accessible. So then I started working with schools, training teachers, learning the system, like how do I do that? And so it was kind of a progressive journey. So we started working with schools and bringing it to more schools. And this was just in Canada, then moving into the United States, then Australia, New Zealand. I think we're in 13 countries right now. And then I'm just my basic nature, like I like to develop things. So I would look at the models and think, okay, yes, we have the cognitive classroom, because that's the first model I created. So the students, there'd be a cognitive classroom running all day, the students coming in and out. doing the work. And then I got this idea of what I call the whole cohort model, where the students are just doing it in their regular classroom. And I think we started that probably maybe 6 years ago. I'm not sure exactly, 6 or 7. But again, just starting in one grade and doing some research and looking at the outcomes. And then having lots of conversations, because it takes an educator that's visionary to say, hey, yes, I'm going to put this, from grades 1 to grade 6. And I met a very visionary educator in Madrid, and also one in New Zealand, because I would talk about this when I traveled. And they said, yes, let's try it, through the multiple grades. And we've done research and shown the benefit. And now more schools are coming on board. So it's that one has probably been about 6 years that we've been trialing. And I'm a big proponent of trialing things, doing research, the evidence base to show that yes, this is of benefit before I implement it really, really widely. And we're with a different population, hopefully starting a research study in October in Madrid with young offenders, right? Individuals age 14 to 18 that are starting to, like youth at risk, getting identified by the juvenile justice system. And so I'm really, really excited. We'll do imaging of their brains. We'll look at cognitive measures. 4 months, they'll be doing one of the cognitive exercises that changes consequential thinking, insight. I have I've had a few cases, like individual cases, where I've seen incredible benefits. So now this will be, doing an experiment. So I'm really excited about that. Like, I'm really always looking at how can my work be of benefit to humanity? And so pushing the boundaries. And we did a study in Tasmania, students that had significant trauma, like really, really significant emotional trauma. And so their learning had shut down. Like, we know that trauma affects the brain. And we found as they went through the work, they started to accelerate in the rate of learning, cognition changed. So really, yeah, really excited. So I'm always looking at how can we make this work accessible, and what groups of individuals can benefit from this work.
I love that. I'm so excited to keep following your work and see what's happening. And yeah, it's very exciting. I think it's an approach that has been missing, even though you've been there trying to do it for a long time. I'm excited that it's gaining momentum, because I think it's a piece that's missing in most schools. There's too much like, oh, well, they're learning, and then we just hand them like more flashcards or something and there are other approaches that are helpful, but then sometimes they get locked into this program, and this one program is supposed to fix everybody with dyslexia. And we know that, like we've said, it's not going to work. Okay, well, I want to wrap this up, but I mean, I also don't want to wrap this up. Need to wrap this up. Okay, so any last pieces of words of wisdom, advice that you want to give to any parents or educators that are listening today?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, like, listen deeply to your children and listen deeply to your students, right? And not make assumptions. Like, every time I make an assumption, I usually regret it. And it's human nature to make assumptions or lump, individuals into categories, because it just makes things easier. But really listen deeply to your children and to your students and observe. Like, they're going to teach you a great deal. Like, I have learned so much from the individuals that I've worked with over the years, and they were instrumental in helping me create my work, because I listened very deeply, and we kind of became partners in developing this work. So I think that would be my first piece of advice. And then the others around growth mindset that you talked about, that really supporting your child or your student in developing a growth mindset, because that's going to serve them for the rest of their life.
Yes. Beautiful. Okay. I will definitely encourage everyone check out the show notes. I'll have all the links to all of the websites and all those resources, the cognitive questionnaire that everybody can do. That was fun and simple, and it was just like kind of I just did it on myself and just like gaining insight, like even just the questions of just thinking through like, okay, how much of a problem is this for me? Like that is that beginning piece like you talked about of that understanding. So I love that. We'll encourage everyone to go do the questionnaire and then progress from there and contact you from there. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on, Barbara.
Oh, well, thank you. I really, really appreciate you having me on, because my goal is to build awareness for this incredible organ that we have, the brain, and its capacity for change and for its implementation in education. So thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.